Welcome everybody to today's briefing. We're just going to give it a few more minutes for folks to trickle in and then we'll get started.
Karina, we lost the photo of you. I mean, the picture of you. There you are. Okay.
Thanks everyone for joining. Again, we're going to give it a few more minutes for people to join the meeting. Thanks again for joining us, folks. We're going to give it one more minute and then we'll get going. All right, good afternoon and welcome to today's briefing, Putting Workers First, Supporting Working People on the Job in Congress and in the Courts, presented by the Progressive Caucus Action Fund. I'm Ross Brennan, Senior Legislative Affairs Associate here at PCAF, he, him, and I will be moderating today's panel. As we get started, please introduce yourself in the chat. We'd love to know where you're from, your names and pronouns, your organization, and anything else you'd like to share. Many of you are probably seeing a pop-up poll on your screen. Please be sure to answer it as it helps us understand what you want to learn and how you want to engage during today's briefing. Before we start, I have three brief housekeeping notes. First, we are going to dig deep into policy discussion today, but we will not engage in electoral or partisan conversations during the session. Second, we've enabled automatic closed captioning. If you go to the bottom of the screen and click on live transcript, you can enable the closed captioning. As it is AI, it is often imperfect, so we'll also be adding improved captions before we send a video of this event to you later this week. Lastly, we encourage you to ask questions of our incredible panel. These briefings are only as good as audience engagement, so we appreciate you asking questions and engaging with us. You can drop your question in the chat or in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get to as many questions as we can. So with that, today's briefing comes at a crucial time for the labor movement. All across the country, workers are striving for a fundamental reorganization of power in the workplace to amplify their voices and bargain collectively for better working conditions. From the Teamsters' upcoming contract fight with UPS to Starbucks workers demanding fairness in their coffee shops, there's a recognition that multi-billion-dollar corporation and greedy employers have not shared their record-breaking profits with the workers who actually produce that wealth. While this renewed energy and organizing momentum provides hope to workers everywhere, there are still structural barriers that make the fight for union recognition and strong collective bargaining contracts difficult in an economy that is stacked against working people. And while the public's approval for labor unions is at the highest point since 1965, union membership dropped to a record low in 2022. So how do we get here, and what policies are needed to create an economy that benefits workers, not just corporations and the ultra-wealthy? To answer these pressing questions and to learn more about what can be done to support the workers who are organizing for better pay, benefits, and protections on the job, we are joined by an excellent panel of workers, activists, and labor policy experts on how we can grow solidarity and build a strong unionized workforce and an economy that works for all of us. I'm going to introduce them each briefly, and then we'll dive into our conversation because I want to be sure we have plenty of time for your questions. Remember, you can drop your questions into the Q&A box, and we'll get to as many as we can. First, it's my pleasure to introduce Nzinga Hooker, the Policy Director at the National Black Workers Center. Nzinga is committed to supporting power building and leadership development in Black communities, and to use her legal experiences and skills in service of that work. We are also joined by Samantha Sanders, the Director of Government Affairs and Advocacy at the Economic Policy Institute, where she works to ensure that policymakers and advocates have access to EPI research that supports improving the lives of workers and their families and reducing economic inequality. And next, we're joined by Willie Burden Jr. Willie serves as in-house counsel at the International Brotherhood of Teamsters. In his role for the Teamsters, he provides counsel to the Amazon Division, Healthcare Subdivision, the Human Rights and Diversity Commission, and the Department of Political and Legislative Action. Next, I'm delighted to introduce Abigail Disney, an Emmy Award-winning documentary filmmaker, activist, and host of the All Ears podcast. Her latest film, The American Dream and Other Fairy Tales, co-directed with Kathleen Hughes, made its world premiere at the 2022 Sundance Film Festival. She advocates for real changes to the ways capitalism operates in today's world. And last but not least, I want to welcome Trina Blair, a Disneyland cast member and participant in the film The American Dream and Other Fairy Tales. In 2019, Trina and her husband Ralph spearheaded the creation of the SEIU Food Pantry for Disney workers, a program hundreds have come to rely on. But before we dive in, I want to start by sharing the trailer for the documentary that I think is the perfect frame for our conversation today, especially since we're so lucky to have the filmmaker and one of the film stars with us.
Aww.
Disneyland was not like anywhere else on Earth. When I started working at the park, the employees were so happy to be there. The company appreciated you. Or at least it did.
Having the last name Disney is like having a weird superpower you didn't ask for. But then one day, I got a message from a guy named Ralph who worked at Disneyland.
How many of you know somebody who works at Disney who slept in their car in the last couple of years? How many of you know somebody who have gone without medical care because they can't afford it?
The American dream teaches us that if you work hard enough, anything is possible. It's magical thinking.
Dr. Disney.
Disney could raise the salaries of all of its workers to a living wage. It was possible to do this when my great-uncle and grandfather built the company. It's possible now.
That is socialism.
Here we go.
We know what that is.
We're the people who do the pixie dust at night. You scrub the kitchens, the floor, the toilets. With both of us working full-time, we still fall below poverty level.
A custodian would have to work for 2,000 years to make what Bob Iger makes in one.
The Disney company is ground zero of the widening inequality in America.
You know, I think of it as the assholification of America.
This isn't just a Disney story. It's the story of nearly half of American workers who can't make ends meet.
I have this passion growing within me now, building power for working class people like me.
If you could tell Disney anything, what would you tell them?
We'd like to be able to have a home.
I got to see the film yesterday and highly recommend folks to watch it. It's really powerful and really well done, really compelling. And so with that, Trina, I want to start with you. Can you talk about some of the obstacles that people working at Disney are facing and share more about the incredible organizing that you're doing?
Yeah, some of the obstacles people are facing at Disney is they have to choose between medical or housing. A lot of times you have more than one people sharing apartments, just so that way they could be able to split the rent, where one's actually in the bed and the other one's on a couch, because the fact is that it's hard to get 2 beds in there, or the bed's in the living room while there's another bed in the bedroom. You also have it where people sometimes can't afford the medical usage. We have a lot of people who just can't simply afford a place to stay, so they have to sleep in their cars. Have it where they have to drive hundreds of miles away because that's the cheapest place to afford, just to come out and be able to work for the company, and sometimes spend nights on friends' couches, just so that way they don't have to keep traveling to and from every night to do it. So they go days, sometimes weeks, without seeing their family, just so that way they can make some money, so that way they can have a place for their family to live. It's strong, it's hard, but some of the things I've been working on is been just constantly promoting the storyline of American Dreams and Other Fairy Tales, and I started up a food bank at SEIU with our group and everything, so that way people could be able to have food, because that was another struggle that a lot of people had, was not being able to afford groceries. So I started that. I am still working and trying to get more going. I have transferred into attractions now, which is into Teamsters. So I'm just trying to start and work in the process of getting that going, but making people aware of their rights and their foods and everything else to be able to do. That's what I am starting off and just going. It's a whole nother system, because each department is different, but I have not stopped. I keep pushing forward to trying to not only make people aware, but also to find ways to improve and help people out.
Amazing. Yeah. And thank you for all your activism and your work. I'm certainly, a lot of on the call appreciate it. And I want to turn to you, Abigail. Obviously, this is a personal film for you, and you've been traveling around the world with the film and talking to working people fighting for change in their communities. What stood out to you in those conversations, and how has the process of making this film shaped your own advocacy and activism?
Oh, well, you just heard Trina talk about, what she and other workers there are up against. And, I've obviously been a member of this family my whole life, and I've contended in my private and public life with the meaning of this last name to people I meet. And in much of my life, I spent in different kinds of activism, working to live my name down, or working in spite of my name, or working against people's preconceptions about me. And I always kept the company and anything having to do with the company at arm's length, because I thought, I just don't want to go near that. It's just too complicated, too fraught. But it was Trina's husband, Ralph, who reached out to me on Facebook in a message and said, is there any way you can support us? And it just raised a whole, hornet's nest of possible issues and conflicts. And my first impulse was to say, of course, I'm just one shareholder. Nobody cares. They hate me over there, by the way. And I can't even imagine how I can be helpful. And then once I sat with that answer for a minute, I thought, well, that's not really a truthful answer, because this last name is very powerful. And that company relies on it really heavily, especially to market itself as a company that sort of has this ineffable, beautiful quality that unites families and brings people together and creates joy. And they're kind of exploiting that part of the name in order to get away with what they're doing to the human beings who work for them. And I kind of broke the year that Bob Iger took $65 million home, like something broke for me. Maybe it was a dam that broke for me. And I had to admit to myself, I didn't have no power. And there wasn't nothing I could do. And that's when I started thinking about making the film. And I have to say, I'm so grateful that Ralph reached out to me, and I'm so grateful I went out and sat with the workers and heard from Trina and everyone else in the film, and lots of other people too. And because, you know, I come from a very different life, and that sure doesn't seem right. Because the very different life I came from it's the fruits of the labors of the people I was sitting with. Why are we living on two different planets? That doesn't strike me as at all appropriate or just. And so the more I heard, the more convicted I got, and convinced that I really needed to see if I could sort of exploit my last name to make something change. So I've been working ever since. I'm loving the relationships I'm forming. I have to say that corporate America is astonishingly hard to move or even get to think on this subject. It's really remarkable just how immovable they are. But I have, because I have this weird life, I have a little bitty bit of my toe in the door, and I'm going to use that to just keep making their lives uncomfortable. Because there's no one who should feel comfortable with the system as it currently is set up.
Well, we're glad to have you on this side of the fight for sure, Abigail. And now I want to turn to Nzinga. The National Black Workers Center is building power with and for Black workers across the country. And as we know, workers' rights are civil rights. What are some of the issues that Black workers are facing at this moment? And how can we build an economy in which Black workers can thrive?
Yeah, and you know, I appreciate Trina and Abigail, because a lot of what we do is around power building, and it is around shifting those common narratives. So yeah, there's a lot to this question. I'm just going to talk a little bit about some of the issues that Black workers are faced with, some of the major issues, and then what the National Black Workers Center is doing as a part of this long time, movement to build an economy that works for us all. So there are a number of issues. There, as many of you know, there's the opposition's agenda. Abigail kind of talked about that, an agenda that is against building worker power. We are in this midst currently of a deep power struggle. And we saw that at play with the Tennessee legislature. There was a power struggle between policymakers, between old ways and new ways, workers and employers, organizers and advocates, right? The Black working class is up against a well-organized, well-funded, racist, sexist, fear-mongering foe, and the narratives they perpetuate. The narratives of the American dream, you work hard enough, you get whatever it is that you need. And a lot of those narratives have been internalized by Black workers. You should be happy with any job that you have. You get paid what you're worth. There are people who are less deserving of a living wage, of housing, and that if you keep your head down and you go along, things will turn out better for you. So these are all the narratives that are meant to stifle resistance, to maintain the status quo, to keep people from challenging employers, from challenging these systems and joining together to do so. So we address a lot of that in our work. And there is this bullying of working people that is often not discussed, and that people are really forced to hold on to fear, to intimidation, to the hesitation to speak up. In this climate, with Black workers, it starts with discrimination and oppression of people, and it leads to this vicious cycle of job loss, of unequal pay, workplace injuries, losing your job, and then losing your benefits. And our responses to these conditions goes beyond the workplace. We have been socialized not to go against authority or power more broadly. So this is a common working while Black story, which is not always knowing how or when to respond. So we're dealing with that. We're also dealing with the infringement on our right to organize. Black workers are in this employment crisis of low wages, low quality jobs, higher unemployment rates, workplace safety and health issues, and significantly higher instances of workplace discrimination. Oftentimes, harassment, violence, and discrimination is talked about as a thing of the past, but racial discrimination is pervasive in the workplace and is alongside a constant devaluing of Blackness and our struggle and our pain. And pieces of this is seen in the current legislation, current racial discrimination case against Tesla involving a Black elevator operator who was met with racist slurs and caricatures and epithets. And there's currently this back and forth regarding damages. What is excessive? What is needed, right? And one of the most repugnant of all racist symbols is the noose, right? There's origins of it connected to the history of Black people being lynched in this country as a form of social control. And it is a common symbol of intimidation and harassment in the workplace. It was reported in the past 7 years that more than 40 incidents of nooses being hung up in building sites and offices across the US and Canada, right? And I discussed that because this is an issue that's central to many of the issues that Black workers face. Discrimination, racism, violence it is why there are so many Black workers placed in entry-level positions. There's why there's so much wage theft and surveillance, because that is what it leads to it. So I think it's often important to name those issues, and there's many others, before we can understand what it takes to build an economy that actually works for Black people, that actually supports Black people in thriving. You know, at the National Black Worker Center, we do our work through an understanding that many of the workplace issues are a result of systemic racism, discrimination, and capitalism. So any rebuilding, any transformation has to deal with that. So we seek to change those systems, to dismantle those systems, and we seek to change the default. And I'll talk a little bit more about this later. A lot of that is a part of our work with the Black Worker Bill of Rights campaign. It seeks to change the default worker because of most of US policy has the default set as the cis heterosexual white male worker, which has resulted in many marginalized people being excluded from opportunities and from power. So I'll just wrap up my remarks with a part of what it takes to build a new economy that works for Black workers is power building, is also solidarity. Advocacy groups must be in community. We must share strategy and be in solidarity with one another. We must support the struggle of all marginalized workers. And we must align and not silo ourselves based on state lines or specific policy focus. And I'll pause there.
No, that was fantastic. A great reminder that white supremacy and discrimination hurts all of us as a working class, you know. Sam, I want to turn to you next. We've heard from Trina and Nzinga about some of the very real obstacles that workers face when organizing on the job. The National Labor Relations Board, or the NLRB, is a place where workers are supposed to be able to turn when employers violate their rights at work. As we see worker organizing ramp up across the country, has the NLRB been able to keep up? And if not, why not?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Ross. And I think you foreshadowed the answer a little bit there in the question in a way that's helpful. But I think I can provide a little context for folks who are newer to the issue of why the NLRB really matters. And I think it builds off the comments that we've heard from the other great panelists so far about what the obstacles are, you know, that you actually face when you decide to join together with your fellow colleagues and bargain. So I'll just say a little bit about the role the NLRB plays, what it is, and what it means for it to be as busy and overworked and overburdened as it is as an agency. So the National Labor Relations Board, or NLRB, is an independent federal agency that enforces the National Labor Relations Act, or the NLRA. And that's the law that gives most private sector workers the legal right to organize, join unions, bargain collectively, and do certain other protected activities with their coworkers. It's headquartered here in DC, but there are regional offices across the country. And the NLRB is where workers and unions file a petition for a union election, like to say that they want to be represented by a union. And it's also where they can file charges that alleges that their employer has violated the NLRA. This is called an unfair labor practice, or ULP charge. And then the NLRB will investigate those charges and facilitate a settlement or hold a hearing with an NLRB judge and decide the case. So it's an independent federal agency. It's governed by the board, which has 5 members who are appointed to terms by the president, confirmed by the Senate. And then there's also the Office of the General Counsel, who's also appointed by the president to a 4-year term. So that's an enormous job already. I just want to say that to emphasize, like, so people understand what it means when we say we want to support the capacity of the NLRB and build that capacity for what they do. That's really, really important work. And then on top of that, in the last few years, you add on that there has been this real increase in union activity, kind of like what we've been discussing. This has been partly driven by workers who are really activated and motivated by the dangers of the pandemic, when they saw how risky things were, or they wanted to be able to come together to demand better working conditions from their employers, to deal with the economic crisis, and to really kind of lock in, some of the protections that they just didn't have. So during fiscal year 2022, the NLRB actually saw across the country a 53% increase in representation cases from the previous year. So that's a 53% increase in filings for union elections, like workers saying we want to vote to be represented by a union. And there was also a 19% increase in that year in unfair labor practice, or ULP, charges being filed. So accounting for both types of those cases, the NLRB saw a 23% increase overall in cases from 2021, which was the largest both single year increase and percentage increase in decades. So the agency is extremely hardworking, very busy, but also chronically understaffed and underfunded. So just this past year, the reconciliation package actually gave the NLRB its first federal budget increase since fiscal year 2014. And that increase was really critical, but it's still not the level the agency really needs to not just maintain the status quo, but expand kind of their capacity. And the role of the NLRB is really critical in this because, as others have pointed out, and as folks know, this is not a level playing field between workers who are trying to organize and the employers, the companies, the corporations that employ them. EPI research has estimated that employers spend as much as $400 million a year collectively on union avoidance consultants. Now, some of that is totally union busting activity, but it's totally legal under the law, unfortunately. However, we also know that have estimated that employers are charged with violating federal law, so actually engaging in those unfair labor practices, in 41.5% of all union election campaigns. So workers are up against the lot when they decide to actually exercise their rights in this way. And the NLRB is really critical to have this fair adjudicator and monitor over this process to make sure that employers are following the rules and essentially that workers can have free and fair elections. Like, it is a workplace democracy issue.
Thanks, Sam, so much for that. And next, I'll go to Willie. The International Brotherhood of Teamsters is America's largest, most diverse union, representing everyone from public defenders to sanitation workers to zookeepers. Right now, your members are caught up in a case before the Supreme Court that goes right to the heart of protecting our right to organize and fight for our rights on the job. Can you talk about the case and why it matters so much?
Absolutely. And I think to start the conversation, we can provide some context that, really what this case can be summed up to be is, quite frankly, another attack on the rights of workers to organize, the rights of workers to stand up for what they deserve and to push back against their employer. In addition to the financial difficulties and the funding difficulties that we see, we also have to deal with the reality that sometimes, in most cases, if it works for labor, it's illegal or it soon will be illegal. And so unions have had to work around this type of structure for forever and for honestly. And so I think this is just another example of that, but provide some background on the case specifics. So first and foremost, there's a claim that the Teamsters Union intentionally destroyed an employer's property in the course of a labor dispute. The labor dispute in question happened in August of 2017. It was a strike by cement truck drivers. There's approximately 80 to 90 drivers, and the property in question was the concrete contained in some of the trucks at the beginning of the strike. Important detail in regards to the understanding of the full context of what was happening. Some of the drivers were actually still in the yard. Some were out. Approximately 16 drivers were actually out on current jobs, and a few were also in commute. Nevertheless, the drivers on August 11th were called out on strike for the purpose of demanding a new CBA. The existing agreement had expired, and the employer was giving the union difficult time at the table, trying not to reach a new CBA. So as unions do, they engage in their collective rights to engage in economic warfare, i.e. a strike. And so in this case, the striking drivers went out on strike, but in this case, they returned their trucks to the Glacier yard and left them running, which is also a critical fact, precisely so that the concrete would not harden, that the trucks would not be harmed, and that Glacier's interests would otherwise be safeguarded, allowing the company to do with the concrete as they saw fit. Instead, Glacier decided to dispose of the concrete. It failed to arrange for replacement workers or additional management personnel, which is typically usually what employers do. And they knew this even notwithstanding that there was the expiration of the collective bargaining agreement and the no strike clause that was in the agreement. With that being said, I would say that the IBT has supported the local, which is Local 174, who is handling the case directly. We've supported them fully in this effort. Our general position is that the case was decided correctly by the Washington Supreme Court. The employer alleged several tort state law claims, including conversion, trespass to chattels, tortious interference with contract and intentional interference with contract, civil conspiracy to destroy concrete, negligent misrepresentation, and fraudulent misrepresentation. Our position is that, as always, the NLRA preempts all of these issues under the Garment Doctrine. For those that do not know or familiar with the Garment Doctrine, it prohibits states from regulating activities that are actually or arguably protected under the NLRA. As Samantha mentioned, it includes bargaining, organizing, and all provisions concerning the governing of unfair labor practices, which includes strikes and collective action. The damage to the employer's concrete products, as determined by the court, was incidental to the work stoppage and also did not come what is known in what is called the local fillings exception to the NLRA Garment Doctrine preemption standard. That exception is usually used for when states have an interest in violating conduct akin to vandalism. So that is the actual argument that the company is putting forth. In addition to that, the negligent misrepresentation claims and the fraudulent misrepresentation claims come from a circumstance in which where after the strike was ended, the employers, as usual, make a request for the workers to return. The union representatives informed them that the drivers had been instructed to respond to dispatch. The employer took that upon himself to mean that the drivers would be available at the very next job. And another critical fact of this is that in order to ensure that guarantee or to get that message, he actually did not even call the union directly. He called the contractor for the job and asked them to call the union to see if the workers were going to actually show up. Well, the company, because some of the drivers, in a very short time frame, a few hours before the end of between the ending of the strike and the next job that the employer wanted the members to commence, because all of the drivers did not or were not available to participate in that, the company decided they were going to sue also as well for fraudulent misrepresentation. Of course, the Washington State Court, in our opinion, decided that correctly too, claiming that the union statements, representative statements, was actually just a promise for future performance, and it did not specifically instruct anyone to show up at the immediate job, and that the employer did not have the right to construe it in that manner. I think as it concerns the implications of the case, I think we should all be concerned to what the erosion of, or the potential erosion of the Garment Doctrine will mean. And that's both sides, all parties, it's unions and companies. At least we're talking about some expansion of the local filling exception that now takes intentional acts and allows them to be to fall within those exception, even if they're not necessarily vandalism or rise to that level of conduct. It's possible that the entire doctrine may be eroded completely. But again, it's also possible that they simply uphold the rights of party to sue for these intentional harmful acts when they actually occur, but find that they did not occur in this situation. All that's possible. But with that being said, any party advocating for the expansion should consider the potential tortious harms that are also inflicted by companies and in regards to the collective bargaining and organizing context. That includes defamation, intentional infliction of emotional distress, acts of fraud, acts of deceit, acts of trespass when they illegally surveil and steal intellectual property, and also search personnel's items through random company policy checks. Interference with contracts and also negligent misrepresentations as well are all things that can be alleged both ways. And so I think that we should all be cautious in regards to how we view this. But nevertheless, I will say that is not going to be a deterrent to unions either. So I want to make sure that I add that at the end of the day, we will continue to be resilient and we will continue to find the ways to do what we need to do in order to protect our members' rights. So.
Truly worrying, but we'll keep our eyes on it, obviously. And so before we get into audience questions, I'd like to direct this next question to the entire panel. So feel free to jump in. We've heard about the incredible organizing going on across the country and about some of the obstacles working people face, from corporate greed to a captured court system. What does Congress need to do to support working people and address those challenges?
Anybody? It's not me. I will say that the NLRB needs to be fully funded and fully empowered. It's been starving to death for a really long time and quite by design. And then we need the government to get behind workers' rights fully and with full throat. Because too long, especially in the Democratic Party, there's been a lot of talking out of both sides of our mouths because of the very enthusiastic participation of corporate and mega donors to campaigns on the Democratic side. So they need to walk the walk that they have not been walking for quite some time now. So, and then we need really a whole narrative shift in this country, because, right now, by and large, we're teaching our children that capital is more important than labor. And without capital, there's no labor, but without labor, there's no capital. They need to be understood to be, as important as each other. They need to respect each other's rights, and there needs to be equal rights and dignity on both sides.
Yeah, and I'll just add on to, Congress supporting worker efforts. There are a number of worker bills of rights that are pending. And that is one way in which Congress can support working folks. There's the domestic worker bill of rights, the restaurant worker bill of rights. There's a part-time worker bill of rights. So there's a lot that Congress can support that would help with building worker power. Also championing NBWC's Black Worker Bill of Rights. We, a lot of the issues that I discussed earlier, what this Black Worker Bill of Rights seeks to do is to address those issues. It's 10 rights that we have outlined through a collective effort of workers, giving their perspective and their solutions, a coalition of Black worker-led organizations that have given their ideas and solutions to address those issues, to address the job crisis that we are currently in. It speaks to everything from the right to organize that we're discussing today, to the right to participate in democracy, to the right to be free from surveillance, which is a big issue that a lot of folks are taking up. And the ability to control our own labor, which is a major thing that workers are asking for, workers are needing, especially in this current economy as an alternative to that worker control. One of our coalition members, Mother and Justice, said that they believe this coalition that is leading this Black Worker Bill of Rights will create a new standard for Black workers, a blueprint for employers who want to improve working environments and retain staff, and an opportunity for this country to offer restorative justice for the institutionalized workplace racism that has been present. So this Bill of Rights is seeking to do a lot. And we're planning a summit, which Jessica will send out after this call, that would dig more into our policy platform that we will be releasing and ways in which folks can partner with us, because this is a big effort. But there's a lot that Congress can do, which is really around putting people over business interests, supporting worker movements, and these different advocacy tools that we're creating, and just listening to workers, what workers say is the problem and what is the solution.
I think I would co-sign what's already been mentioned, especially around shifting how, even like the narrative kind of through which policymakers approach these issues. And then I'll also be boring and say like a more concrete, a concrete or smaller, I shouldn't say smaller picture because it would still be very expansive legislation, which is to pass the PRO Act, the Protecting the Right to Organize Act. I think some of what we're talking about here is both defending the rights that we already have that have been really hard fought, that workers need to be able to protect their rights on the job, protect their wages, protect their safety in the workplace, protect their healthcare and all these other things. And then there's also needing to expand beyond to do real labor law reform and think about what's needed there. And the Protecting the Right to Organize Act, or the PRO Act, would really be groundbreaking in terms of that. Some of what we've talked about, some of what Trina and others are talking about in terms of the obstacles, the retaliation, the intimidation, all of these things that you face when it comes to trying to form a union in your workplace. Some of those are illegal activities by employers, right? Like firing and retaliation and threats and all of these and all of these things. And a lot of what employers do to stop workers from forming unions is totally legal, right? It's totally legal to force everybody to attend all staff meetings with anti-union presentations, and to pull people, have these one-on-ones with people where you, kind of fearmonger about the union, and to lie, make claims about what union dues will be used towards, and to bar workers from canvassing for the union, on the work site in some situations and stuff like that. And so I think, it's there's not a requirement for even after workers go through all that and successfully form a union, there's not a requirement for how quickly that the employer needs to, bargain with them to establish the first contract. So the PRO Act would take a look at a lot of these things and actually that are currently legal and say, actually, no, we need to rethink how that goes and make a lot of these protections a lot more expansive and a lot tighter. So I would say pass the PRO Act for sure.
And I'll keep my comments brief because I just think I agree with everything that was just said. And I can say just from a practical example in my everyday work, the biggest issue is that most employers see violating labor law as a cost of business. They understand that they can do it and that the only thing that may come their way as regards to a negative consequence is that they may have to pay the worker the money that they were already obligated to pay them had they not terminated them for unlawful reasons in the first place. And so we have to find a way to hold employers accountable, and we have to also figure out a way to fund these agencies so that the workers also can at least maybe be put back into the workforce at a time that is appropriate for them to still be able to continue their organizing efforts, and to not allow employers to just erode the union support into nothing before anything can be done about it. So
I would like to say that I agree with everybody that's been saying what needs to be done, because workers, especially from Disney, from where I come from, where I work, a lot of people are scared. A lot of people are frightened that they're going to be losing their jobs if they step forward. We had it where there was a threat that Disney was going to have their workers go on strike. A lot of people didn't want to do the strike because the fact is they felt like if they went and did the strike, they would lose their jobs. So they decided to sign for whatever the contract had at that moment in time, saying that this is the best one we'll ever have, not knowing that we could have gotten better if we actually took that moment to take that next step. Because if we took that step and we were truly able to feel comfortable and safe that we weren't going to lose our jobs for something. I mean, most of the people who do work there are long-term. There are quite a few that are not, but the long-term people are the ones that are really truly scared that if they go and step out and get out of their comfort zone and try to stand up and say, hey, we deserve with what we get paid, what we work for, we deserve that pay. They're afraid they're going to lose their jobs. They're scared. And it's something we do need to change.
Ronald Reagan took the oath of office in 1981 in January, and in February, he fired every PATCO worker who was striking. If you know your history books, you're all younger than me, so I actually remember it. But that, interestingly, if you read the book Invisible Hands, you'll see there's a letter from a CEO at the time that was to a friend that said, when he fired those Patco workers, we all took it as a signal, a very clear communication to the business community that there was a new sheriff in town. And that new sheriff has been in charge for 40 plus years since then. So really and truly, there needs to be a massive cultural shift. And two things have to be restored: respect for workers and the dignity of every human being, and then shame. A little shame would be nice, because it would be really nice to be able to shame some of these corporations for their anti-union organizing.
Absolutely. And thank you all for each of your excellent insights there. My colleague Heejin just started a wrap-up poll. We'd love to hear from you with your feedback as we turn to our audience questions. So please answer that poll as we dive into your questions. Again, if you'd like to ask a question that you haven't already, please use Zoom's Q&A function. I'll be drawing from these questions and posing them to our panelists, and I'll try to get as many as we can. So to kick it off from the audience, this is a clarification for you, Willie. Does that mean that the court could force workers to give their labor or get sued in a strike situation? What could we do to better protect workers' rights to strike?
Well, quite frankly, unions are going to have to be creative in how they go about striking. I mean, to go back to the possibilities of what could come. I mean, at the worst, this opens up unions for exercising, or for at the prospects of exercising collective action and then being sued for any economic harm that the employer can arguably make. Economic or property harm that the employer could arguably make, and they would be able to do so in state court. They would be able to bypass the NLRB and thus take the entire consideration out of the statutory requirements that were put forth by Congress to actually govern these matters. And so that's very important for us all to understand that if that happens, then anytime workers come together, you can imagine, and the employer has products that spoil. You can imagine Starbucks for a situation. Imagine the union being sued for all of the coffee in the Starbucks shop that went bad the day that the workers decided to step up and fight for their safety and health rights. For just for an example. And so, yes, that is a possibility. Again, we hope that that's not the case, but we will be resilient regardless. Unions have dealt with other limitations before, and so if this limitation does come, it's just a matter of how we're going to have to reorganize and fight back. And again, I will reiterate the point that it works both ways. And so if that does happen, unions are also going to have to consider now what claims we should also bring in state court. But again, I don't think that any of this is probably good for us, as it certainly opens up the possibility of the lack of consistency in decisions across the entire United States, and that's the other large implication here. But yes, as it concerns protecting the rights, we need to continue to have those conversations with Congress. If there are any, is a decision that has in any way an effect that is deemed to erode the Garmon Doctrine, Congress should immediately step in and reestablish that. That I think would be the most critical step. But again, nevertheless, we're going to have to find a way to push forward anyway.
Great, thanks for that, Willie. Another question that we have for the whole panel. Often when we think about unions, we imagine workers in the mid-20th century clocking into a factory with smokestacks on top. However, the modern workforce looks and works differently today. What opportunities and challenges does the new economy pose for workers seeking to unionize?
I guess I can take a stab at that. I think right now, misclassification is probably one of the most critical issues as it concerns labor and employment. As we all may know, currently right now, even though we have a general counsel who's the most progressive general counsel, at least that I have known at the NLRB, misclassification in itself is not a violation of the NLRA as we currently stand. And employees have rights, but independent contractors do not have rights, and also managers and supervisors do not have rights under the NLRA. So when you have rampant misclassification, particularly in the transportation industry, all of us are very familiar with perhaps the Amazon Flex program, Uber and Lyft. These individuals do not have rights under the NLRA to organize, to bargain over their working conditions. And that's something that obviously we are of the opinion that they are employees, but nevertheless, we need courts and we need legislators to assist in that process and guaranteeing that companies are required to treat them as such. And I think that, that is the reason why also we're seeing across many states, like for example, in California right now, we see the fight over the ABC test. That's why states are also stepping up to the plate here because of all of the hurdles that we've dealt with at the federal level. And so, I think that as we're moving into this space of also dealing with new technology as well, and the ability for workers to be replaced, the misclassification model is probably the model that most employers are seeking to adopt and promote. And I think it is important that we add the context. The problem is not that they are simply in itself hiring independent contractors. It's that the contracts for the independent contractors are actually drafted akin to employment contracts, where they have complete control over the entire manner and means and method in which these individuals do their work, sometimes in many cases requiring them to exclusively contract only work for the one firm. So when you do that, but at the same time, you label them as independent contractors, so they're not afforded to take advantage of, for example, like insurance rights and different things, different obligations that the employer would otherwise have to adhere to. You can see that it creates a race to the bottom and leaves workers behind. And so that's, I think, for right now, the biggest issue that I'm seeing.
Great, thanks. Oh, go ahead, Trina.
Disney, there's more or less of misunderstanding what the unions are there for. A lot of people don't understand why the unions are there. I was a shop steward when I was in SEIU. I'm trying to become one for Teamsters now, but I still promote and tell everybody exactly what the unions are there and why they're there and why it's so important for us to have a union. And I just keep trying to spread that word, because I do know that that's one of the main things that's at Disney, is a lot of it is misunderstanding of exactly why is a union there? What is the union really for? Do we really need to have the union? And yes, a lot of it is hard for people to kind of wrap their heads around it, to understand. But once they start understanding and seeing it from the perspective that we're trying to help them into getting a better life, to get a better living style, to get better at everything, to get paid for with what you deserve, then they start understanding, and then they start accepting it. And then that's how it slowly is getting spread throughout Disney. But it takes time, but at the same time, it's the promotion of trying to make sure that everybody understands what a union is there for.
Great, thanks for that, everybody. And Trina, I guess a little bit more, could you talk about what unique challenges that you experienced during the pandemic? And also, have any of those challenges resolved themselves, or have they gotten worse for workers and your fellow coworkers?
During the pandemic, we were all notified by email or a letter saying that, hey, right now everybody's going to be basically laid off. And if we need you, you get to come back. We'll call you back. I was fortunate to be called back, but I had to fight to go to a different area, because I was a custodial worker. And when the pandemic hit, a lot of the changes that Disney did was take away the stuff that I could do with the restrictions that I have. So they weren't they says that I can come back, but they have to replace me into another department, but they weren't sure exactly which department to be in. And I fought my way to show them that I could do this with my restrictions, because the way they were sounding is that they weren't going to need me back. They were going to actually try to let me go. So I had to fight my way into staying and proving that this is where things can go, and you can have me with these restrictions in this area. A lot of other people were unfortunate not to go back. There were some that were supposed to be coming back before the end of 2022. When 2023 started, the contract of that kind of ended for them, to where if Disney didn't need to bring them back, they weren't going to be brought back. However, instead of bringing people back, Disney has hired has hired thousands of people to basically take the positions that could have been taken by those that have been previous laid off during COVID. So right now we're dealing with that and fighting with that and trying to make sure that people can have their jobs back if they still want it, or if they found something else to move on, then we just keep moving on.
Thanks for that, Trina. I think we can get to one or two more questions. We have one for Abigail, but also for the panel. What do you think about the gap between worker pay and CEO pay? How do we address the growing gap between workers and the wealthiest few?
Yeah, I've been a little vocal on this subject because it partly because strategically, I think it's really important to really hit on that hard, because you almost don't have to explain it. If people get it at a visceral level, when somebody's making, when it takes somebody more than 2,000 years to make in, what Bob makes in one, or those kinds of pieces of information, there's certain kinds of facts that just make the case by themselves. And that's one of them. I did the math when Bob took the $65 million home, and he could have offered everybody at Disneyland $1,000 annual raise out of his pocket, still taking home $30 million. So it just really, it should enrage people, and I encourage people to be enraged, because rage is a great motivator. So we have to hit on that really hard, because that is all from free cash flow. And free cash flow is the money that you would go to if you were looking to offer people bonuses and salary increases. When Disney got a huge unlooked for windfall tax cut from the Trump tax cuts, they offered their employees what they called bonuses. And the bonuses were at most, yeah, see, Trina's laughing because I know what happened with those bonuses. Many people never saw them. Many people saw half of them and never saw the rest, and so forth. There were lots of contingencies placed on them, and it just evaporated, and no one held them accountable, because you say something, the good news makes it into the paper, and then nobody follows up afterwards. But, if you look at $1,000 of a bonus on a, say, $28,000 a year annual pay, that's not even a tip. That's not even a 15% tip. That's not a help in any way. It's an insult is what it is. And if it came from a tax break, it is a permanent windfall. It didn't just happen this year. If you can afford to give somebody $1,000 bump in 1 year, you can afford to give it to them every year. So I found the whole bonus conversation to be frankly, a slap in the face of workers and an insult to their intelligence and what they know. So the CEO pay, you have to understand, is representative of what's happening across the C-suite, because he's just the tip of the iceberg. What's happening under the water is even more concerning, because there's a waterfall coming down. If he's got 65 million, then you could probably multiply that by 10 to represent what's really happening across the C-suite. As I say, it's all coming out of free cash flow. So this is company money that they could be returning to workers or to management, or in the form of share buybacks, which are equally egregious, or more so in a lot of ways. So companies have a lot of ways to recognize workers' essentialness and to pay them a dignified wage. They've had those things at their fingertips for years now, because profits have been at a record high. And they have never, in fact, pulled any of those levers. If anything, Bob got a bonus of $65 million because he was squeezing his workers, not in spite of that fact. He was being rewarded with that money for that. So again, I keep coming back to things that are a little abstract, like narrative shift. because there are lots of incremental steps we can take in the form of government regulation. And I think that there should be things like CEO pay tethering, where you tether the CEO's pay to the compensation at the bottom so that it never gets more than a certain multiple apart. And so if he wants his salary to go up, then he has to raise everybody's salary. That's a simple thing to do, actually, and I don't understand why we're not doing it. But over and above that, we need to stop celebrating wealthy people just because they're wealthy. We need to stop making a person's net worth an equivalent to what we see as their value on this earth. And we need to stop thinking of making lots of money as a sign of a person's basic worth to the economy and to the society as a whole. We need a mindset shift.
Thanks so much for that. And I know we're going to run a little bit over, but just one last question, if the panel wouldn't mind staying, since it's such a great conversation. What are upcoming fights in the labor movement that we should be paying attention to? How can we build solidarity to support those workers?
I think I'll go first. I'll go first and briefly mention that I think maybe so many people know currently the Teamsters are engaged in negotiation with UPS. And so obviously, that being the largest private sector collective bargaining agreement in the country, we expect it to be the opportunity for people to support this fight and to get involved, because at least from our perspective, we want this agreement to be the model that now then other unions and everyone can take out and go and fight for. And quite frankly, we view this also as the model that potentially we can use to approach Amazon as well and to hold them accountable. And we support all the workers that are already taking those actions across the United States. But I encourage everyone to become knowledgeable about these different engagements and to understand the dynamics, understand the financial considerations at play, and get involved and reach out support where you can, because everyone is paying attention and we all need to be together in these fights if we're going to be able to take on these corporations. So.
Yeah, and just adding to that, the big fight that I'm excited about is workers taking control over their labor, right? Through unions, through worker centers, through cooperatives, through worker standards boards that people are pushing more for to ensure that workers have a say in the standards in that particular industry. And how we be in solidarity is a part of my work is the political education, getting folks to understand how this is all connected, how these systems impact different workers, different identities, and how we overcome those things by working together. For example, we had a pretty interesting conversation a few weeks ago where the Part-Time Worker Bill of Rights was being pushed, and we were speaking about that. And the workers there were saying that they needed to work with temp workers more because the experiences were overlapping, right? The demographics of those folks who were doing part-time work and temp work were similar. And just the understanding of that workers are going to be in solidarity with one another and not allow these corporations and other entities pit workers against each other. I think that's going to be one of the biggest things that we're interested in supporting.
I'm just going to jump in here because I'm not, a formal part of the labor movement. So I just want to say very briefly that I strongly support the One Fair Wage movement, which is to end the sub-minimum wage for tipped workers. It's one of the most egregious crimes against, for the most part, women and women, especially women of color across this country. And the federal tipped wage is still only $2.13 an hour. It's rooted in racism, it's rooted in slavery, and we can't continue to let this happen.
And I think I totally agree with everything that's been mentioned in terms of keeping an eye out. I think just to kind of, go back to kind of the point Nzinga made about everything being interconnected. There's been this debt limit fight going on in Congress, right, where there's kind of a brinksmanship situation trying to force really harmful spending cuts in exchange for kind of raising the debt limit, and making sure the U.S. government can continue to pay off its obligations there. And I just want to encourage folks, to keep an eye on that, because that does have implications for all the things we're talking about. That includes these massive across the board spending cuts and spending caps for some of the federal agencies we've been talking about that are responsible for enforcing, these basic workers' rights. So that's one kind of near-term thing to definitely keep an eye on and think about how that would impact workers' rights to organize, workers' rights to a minimum wage. Making sure that those rights are only as good as the enforcement, to be able to protect them. Right? It's a lot to ask workers to be able to defend themselves in those situations when they're so disempowered. So that's one thing I'd recommend keeping an eye on for sure. The PRO Act, issues around minimum wage, any opportunity to hold employers accountable for violating labor law. And then I guess just to mention one sort of a positive thing also is, recently last month, the state of Michigan repealed right to work. Which we know right to work is a misnomer. It's actually, it doesn't say anything about your right to work. It's the right to work for free. It's just about weakening unions, and it's aligned with, it keeps wages down for all workers, in the states and stuff. So it's great that the Michigan state legislature has repealed that. And I think it will be great to see what, organizing activities go forward there now that they've had that change in labor law.
Great. Well, that does it for today's briefing. Thank you all for joining us today. Thank you to our wonderful panelists, and thank you to the audience. Next week, you'll receive an email with a link to a recording of this call and a Google Doc full of resources on how you can join the fight for workers' rights. If you got a starting now email and you clicked on a Zoom link, so in other words, if your name is participant when you logged in instead of your name, you still need to register to attend the other trainings, and to be sure we have your email to send you the toolkit. Make sure you sign up so that you can also get the great tools we talked about today and the recording of this webinar. We'll be sending reminders out for future briefings and great resources and tools, so be sure to register. I hope you all have a wonderful rest of the day, and thanks again.
Can I just say something before you sign off, Ross? I'm really sorry, but The American Dream and Other Fairy Tales is available. I hate to say the word out loud, Amazon, iTunes, Vudu, any place with a transactional video on demand, please go find it, and please urge other people to watch it too.
Absolutely. Great. Thanks so much, everybody, and take care.